All right, good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Michael Colma, and I'm the head of programs and communications here at International House. Thank you for joining us tonight for Diverse Viewpoints in College Admissions. We appreciate you taking the time to be part of this important conversation. Higher education is currently navigating a period of significant transition. With the end of affirmative action, colleges and universities are re-examining how they approach diversity, access, and fairness in admissions. College admissions, of course, play a central role in shaping campus communities. The decisions made through this process influence not only access to higher education, but also the intellectual environment of universities, the conversations that take place, the questions that are asked, and the opportunities for learning across differences. International House was founded over 90 years ago on the belief that meaningful engagement across cultures, disciplines, and perspectives is essential to higher education. Universities are spaces where ideas should be examined, debated, and refined through open and respectful dialogue, and tonight's event reflects that mission. I want to thank the College Committee of the Chicago Forum Student Board for co-presenting this event, and to everyone who contributed to making tonight possible, with special thanks to Corinne Pompey from the iHouse team and my former iHouse colleague Jocelyn Garcia, who is now with the Forum. We are honored to be joined tonight by a distinguished panel offering different perspectives on college admissions and higher education. We have with us tonight John Tomasi, Inaugural President of the Heterodox Academy, Alexandra Fields, Director of College Counseling at the Latin School of Chicago, and Professor Neil Gross of Colby College. Our moderator for this evening's program is Elsa Batelin. Elsa is a fourth-year undergraduate in the college, studying philosophy, Latin, and Norwegian. In addition to chairing the college committee at the Forum for Free Inquiry and Expression, Elsa is a student marshal for the University of Chicago's class of 2026 and Phi Beta Kappa inductee. She is interested in federal appellate law, and she is a member of Harvard's Law School class of 2031. Now, please join me in welcoming our speakers to the stage. Thank you.
So thank you all for coming here on this cold January night. We really appreciate it. So my name is Elsa, and I'm a fourth year in the college. And recently, I went through my law school applications, and I've been reading a lot of news articles and think pieces, and I keep encountering this one term. It's kind of buzzy. It's called viewpoint diversity. And I don't have a clear understanding of what that means, but it's coming up everywhere. And so I've assembled this panel of experts to help us look at it in the context of college admissions, job applications, and higher ed in general. And we have a star panel today. We have with us Professor John Tomasi, a political scientist and the inaugural president of Heterodox Academy, which is an organization that advances and promotes viewpoint diversity. We have Professor Neil Gross from Colby College. He is a sociologist who studies higher education and intellectual life, and he's published several books, including Why Are Professors Liberal and Why Do Conservatives Care? And finally, we have Alexandra Fields, who is the director of college counseling at the Latin School of Chicago, one of the city's best prep schools and a feeder for the University of Chicago and the Ivy League. So the way that this panel will work is we'll start with a moderated Q&A, and then we'll take some audience questions. So please think of your questions. This is an unmatched opportunity to get to really pick the brains of some experts. So thank you all so much for being here. Feel free to jump in on an answer or a question that I pose to somebody else. And we'll get started with Professor Tomasi. So could you tell us, what is viewpoint diversity, and when did the term enter public discourse?
Imagine if we all thought the same thing. Imagine at a university if everyone had the same view on every topic. It would be a pretty boring place. It wouldn't just be a boring place. It would be a place where there was nothing. So viewpoint diversity is something everyone at the Academy takes seriously and believes in. The question is, how wide the range of viewpoint diversity should it be? What are the parameters of an acceptable community within which we might say we? That is, we think this, we discuss that. That's the frame of the question, I think, not should there be viewpoint diversity, but what are the parameters of viewpoint diversity? And then within that question, there's a whole set of questions about why is it valuable? What does it mean for us to think? If it would be really bad if we all thought exactly the same thing on, say, Hamlet and why he did what he did and why he waited and so on, had the exact same views. What's good about us having different views about that? What's the positive part about that? And I'll stop with that, but we'll say more about that, what I think that positive thing is as we go. Is that all right, or do you want me to?
No, that's perfectly fine. Professor Gross, would you offer the same definition of viewpoint diversity?
So I find the notion of viewpoint diversity, as well as the term intellectual diversity, to be very confused, confused and almost purposefully so. There's no question that there is tremendous intellectual diversity in universities. We have a tremendous number of disciplines and interdisciplines and subdisciplines. We have different approaches and methodologies, and people study different things. So in terms of intellectual diversity, if we're thinking about the kinds of things that matter for the pursuit of truth, for answering scientific questions, I think that diversity is clear. I think most of the people who talk about viewpoint diversity are really interested in ideological diversity or something like political diversity, which are related but not exactly the same. And they're interested in the relationship between political diversity, ideological diversity, and intellectual diversity. That relationship is unclear at the present, I find that the conversation would be better posed if it were around political diversity, which is, I think, ultimately what many on the right are concerned about the lack of in universities.
Okay, so
It'd be better if we were posed on political diversity, did you say?
It would be better for me, it would be better if the conversation were just straightforwardly, do we have enough political diversity? Do we have enough ideological diversity? Because there's no question. I mean, you can go to a department of sociologists, and we may all have very similar views politically, but there's nothing that we'll agree on in terms of how we should approach things. So the intellectual diversity is there. The question is whether there's enough ideological or political diversity.
And so as you and I know, sociology is one of the disciplines which, on the political dimension, has the least diversity.
Right.
And some people think that's a problem with sociology, but you would say it's not. There's lots of kinds of methodological diversity, for example.
It's not that I wouldn't say it may or may not be a problem, but it's not the same kind of problem, right? There's the question of whether there's political diversity is a different problem from whether there is diversity of theoretical or methodological ideas, right? They may be related. It could be that if you have too much political diversity, then the peer review process will be watered down, for example. It could be that if there's too much political diversity, the topics that you may study will be narrowed in ways that they shouldn't be. But there's no, for example, if you were to automatically increase the political diversity of a sociology department, there's no guarantee that you would get more perspectives that would help you better sort, sift and winnow the data to understand the truth.
Do you mind?
Please respond.
What's too much diversity? What would that mean, too much political diversity? Like I have a conception of a university as a community of imperfect learners that were convened not to avoid conflict, as most groups and covenants they create covenants to avoid conflict. At universities, our covenant is rooted in quarrel and in opposition. We come together precisely for the idea that we disagree and that we can learn from each other from those disagreements. I think there is a conceptual way to make sense of there being too much political diversity. Because I think when we're convening to do is not just disagree, it's to track knowledge and to track some understanding in the world. But when you said there's too much political diversity, what did you mean by that?
I don't believe I said too much political diversity.
Oh, I thought you did.
Yeah, I don't.
Oh, forgive me. Okay.
Yeah.
But Professor Tomasi, would you agree that the debate should be had about is viewpoint diversity more properly called political diversity? Is that what people from your organization and others who are calling for this, is that what they're asking for? Political diversity?
I think so. Some people, that's sort of a diagnostic people use. There's some people sort of looking at a delta about the change of the political orientation of faculty. And sort of a broad brush analysis, a broad brush account would be something like 2-to-1 left-right in the 60s. Now it breaks a lot down by department. You could say 17-to-1 left-right. What explains that delta? Is it that we're tracking truth better now, or is it that we are sort of path-dependently choosing each other and choosing ourselves based on assumptions we already have, and our biases are being played out? So I think the question of political diversity is an important element, which politicizes the question of viewpoint diversity. If we stay at a high plane of abstraction, I think we all agree we want multiple people with different views about Hamlet and why he acted the way he did. But if it gets to be different views about Donald Trump or your favorite politician on the left or the right, then it supercharges the conversation. But that shouldn't make us afraid to go in there and ask questions about Do political orientations come from deeply different views about the world? Do political orientations, or might political orientations present different questions as more salient than other political orientations? And if that's the case, and we're searching for truth together in a community, we probably want more political diversity than we currently have. That's not a proof of that. That's just an opening suggestion. But
So it seems like you're diagnosing a problem in the academy, that there is too little political diversity right now, and that one of the goals of a university should be to increase that. Would you agree?
that's a great question. I absolutely agree.
Okay.
I think our ability to be a true community of imperfect learners is greatly constrained by the narrowing of political diversity on the faculty in particular.
Thank you. So we've sort of heard from the academic perspective, but I'd like to turn to Alexandra, who is a practitioner of this. She does this in everyday life. So when a college now is saying that they want an intellectually diverse class, which at least feels like sort of a new thing, certainly when I was doing undergrad applications, there wasn't that much emphasis placed on it. What does that mean when a college says that? And how important is it for students to show that they're going to participate in that intellectually diverse class?
Yeah, thank you. So I think, and it's important to note, so prior to my position at the Latin School of Chicago and before that at another independent school in New York City, I worked for many years in an admissions office as well, reading applications and serving on an admissions committee, where we were writing our supplement questions. So we were deciding what we wanted to ask students and figuring out how we wanted to shape our class. And I will tell you that the questions that colleges and universities are asking right now look very different than the questions that we were asking when I was doing this not that long ago. They've really shifted. And in the last 3 years especially, there has been this shift to a focus on these questions that are kind of getting grouped under this idea of, will you bring viewpoint diversity to our campus? And what these questions tend to look like are things like, tell us about a time that you engaged with someone who had beliefs that were different from your own. Or tell us about a time where you were uncomfortable, with a position that was being shared and how you reacted to that. Or tell us about a time that you stood up for something that you believed in, right? It's getting at these ways that you kind of like engage across difference. The thing that I find, there's a lot of things I find interesting about kind of the proliferation of these questions is I think that they do a good job at getting students to perform if they would like to engage in working with students who have a different belief system from them. I don't think they do anything at actually getting at that. And they also don't do anything at revealing what a student's belief system actually is. And I think that is like the harder question. Is if we actually are interested in building a diverse student body, I don't think those types of questions that you're saying you saw, right, in your law school application process, I don't think those questions are going to help us do it. And then the other thing that I have to point out is it is not a coincidence that those questions started to pop up on applications right after the Supreme Court issued their ruling in Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard and UNC, making it illegal for admissions offices to consider race in college admissions. That marks the exact moment that we see those questions start to pop up on applications. So
What's the connection?
the connection there is that a very, very easy way to consider, one of many ways, to start to build a diverse student body is to consider the various aspects of a student's identity, one of which is their race. And I would argue in America, at least, that's one of the largest aspects of a student's identity that impacts how they move through the world. I would argue also a student's socioeconomic status would be one of those, right? Which is much more kind of like easily ascertained through aspects of the application. I would argue a student's gender identity and sexuality, right? So removing that, that's going to be a big barrier to building a genuinely diverse student body, and that's reflected in the numbers. Like when we now are looking at data, we saw a pretty immediate plummet, specifically in African-American students and Black students in our most elite college campuses. And again, I don't think we can say that's a coincidence when the data bears that out.
That's very interesting. And Professor Gross, I'd love to hear your opinion. Now that we've heard that colleges are making this pivot, especially like post Students for Fair Admissions at the Supreme Court, what type of student do you expect to benefit from this new like viewpoint diversity push? Is this DEI for conservatives, as it's been called in some major news publications, or is it something different? Is it something where maybe a Black student who before would have checked a box on their application and gotten a sort of automatic boost from that, can they now say, from my perspective as a Black student, is that going to help them? Who benefits here?
Well, let me take a second to say something about the political demography of the academy, which might be helpful in understanding or thinking about the broader context here. So Professor Tomasi was talking a bit about changes in the professoriate, and those changes are real, and you can track them over time. There's been a bit of a bounce back over the last few years in the movement of the academy to the left. So it's sort of stabilized. But the undergraduate side is also interesting and quite different. Left-leaning undergraduates considerably outnumber right-leaning undergraduates in the U.S. That's been true for a while. It's certainly true now. There is variation across institutions in the extent to which that is so. It's historically been the case, and it remains the case now, that at more selective institutions, that ratio is more imbalanced. And there is also now, according to some recent interesting research by the economist Riley Acton and her colleagues, a process of essentially institutional polarization, where the schools that, beginning in the 60s, 70s, 80s, that were more left-leaning have become more left-leaning over time. The schools that are more right-leaning in terms of the composition of the student body have become more right-leaning over time. So there are all these differences across the types of institutions. And of course, the last thing to bear in mind is that most students in the U.S. don't go to selective colleges, right? The vast majority of students go to schools that have almost open admissions policies. So that being said, I agree that some of those changes did begin to pop up after the court's decision. But I think that there was another kind of inflection point, and that was after the cessation of the protests in the summer of 2024. I think that there was a period then when there's tremendous pressure at schools like Harvard for the institution to begin to think about how can we address political conflict among students in a better way. And I think that you started to see more of those kinds of essays pop up then. So I think it sort of began, but so I think there was part of it that it is kind of genuinely politically concerned. The question is whether that is influential. And I don't know. Informally, from talking to people in the admissions world, I don't know that that's top of mind for anybody really right now. It could be that it matters a lot in terms of what the universities are signaling or trying to signal to the Trump administration. I don't know. I guess we'll see whether it actually produces changes in the political composition of the student body. Not to go on for too much longer, but I'll say one of the challenges here is that part of what's driving this is that the professional class in the U.S. has undergone a pretty dramatic change in its political orientation over the last 15 years, right? The professional class much more highly oriented toward the Democratic Party, becoming much more left-leaning. And students from professional class families have a significant leg up in getting admissions to selective schools. So it will be a challenge, not impossible. Of course, there's plenty of students on the right who are absolutely brilliant and well suited for these elite schools, and there's no shortage of good numbers of them at schools like Chicago and Harvard. But finding students who would qualify under just the political diversity rubric alone, I think will be challenging for some of the more selective schools.
Yeah.
I also think, as someone who spends their days working with teenagers, there may be a disproportionate number of them at Chicago, but the average teenager's political views are largely informed by their parents' political views, right? Like their ideology and their political views are what their parents do in the voting booth. And so I also just think from like a strategic point of view for an admissions office to try and enroll a particular type of class based on like trying to ascertain where a student stands on certain issues or whatever it is at age 17. You guys have kids here who enroll at 15 because you're so smart, right? Isn't the whole point of going to college that those are probably gonna shift? You take one class that blows your mind and your ideas on something completely change. Like, that's the point. So I think if the goal is like, again, actually to envision a classroom where you're sitting around a table and engaging in really meaningful debate where the student sitting next to you is bringing a perspective that is radically different and challenges your own, then I actually think like a much more effective way to do that is to bring in geographic diversity. Like, you're actually going to much more likely have that because a student who grew up on the border in Texas, regardless of how they might tell you they politically align at 17, is going to have a different perspective on immigration than a student who grew up in Connecticut, regardless of how they tell you they politically align at 17, right? So like, I just think there's all these ways to actually much more effectively bring in the diverse class we're looking for than this mushy viewpoint diversity that I think, to the professor's point, I've struggled to get a handle on the definition of, I guess.
Professor Tomasi, I'd love to hear your response to that. Are there better ways that we could create a politically diverse class, for example, other than screening for viewpoint diversity when the students are 17 years old?
Yeah, I'm not sure that those questions are designed, or it doesn't sound, if they are designed for this, I'm not sure they'd be effective toward getting viewpoint diversity unless they're actually proxy questions or waiting for people to reveal themselves to fill up some boxes. But if the questions are taken as written, as described, there seem to be questions about a different characteristic, which I think is actually more fundamental to the university. And it's actually the greater battle happening in the faculties, in my own view, not between Republicans and Democrats, but between those who believe that the university is a place that's fundamentally a place for searching for knowledge together, as opposed to some who think the university is a place for political action, and that solidarity is more important than disagreement. And they see disagreement as a threat to solidarity, as every leader of any political movement throughout history has always seen and recognized appropriately as a threat. At a university, though, if the university is to be searching for knowledge, if we are going to be a true community of imperfect learners, professors and students alike coming together to let their guards down, to show them each other the things they don't know, because they actually want to learn more from each other. If you think of it that way, then we have to track, I think, in this example, in more structural ways, think about institutions, what are the gatekeeper roles that are being played at different levels of the experience of the university? So who gets to decide who gets in as an undergrad? Who gets to decide who gets in as a grad student? Who gets to decide who gets in as a professor? And I think you'll find if you start looking into those mechanisms that there's a much greater dispersion of people with authority to influence who gets in as an undergrad than there is at the graduate level. At the undergraduate level, it's your high school teacher writing a letter about you, or different kinds of gatekeepers we could describe. It's a complex, wide thing. At the graduate school level, it's a smaller, narrower range of university graduates from places who get into these top schools that have PhD programs. At the professoriate level, it's dominant professors in certain disciplines who are path breakers who get to really determine, and their acolytes determine who is in and who's out for the discipline. So it gets narrower and narrower as you go up, perhaps, if that's up the right way to describe it. And those structural questions are really interesting, I think. But I think the base level, the question about you all, about students, how you get in, that's where there's most dispersion of authority, most dispersion of abilities to say who gets in and credential people. That's why maybe there's more diversity there than anywhere else on the political dimension and other dimensions too.
And so I guess what's the upshot of that? If we agree that there's more dispersion at the student level, how do we go about building a more politically diverse class?
So I thank you.
You can solve the problem for us.
I love that. So what that says to me, I think that is the way things are at the university level. I think there's more diversity, generally speaking, among the undergrads than there are among the professors. It's even less among the administrators, but put them aside for now. That poses a real question, I think, about what is being served up at universities and whether universities are doing the thing we're obliged to do to discharge our obligations to you, the students. Or are we, in fact, inadvertently, I don't think there's some great plot to make the professoriate part left. I mean, there's the Port Huron statement, they did hatch a plot in the 60s, but that's not why it happened. You know, the Port Huron statement, you should read it, Google it, it's pretty good. And it's kind of like wackily good. But anyway, leaving that aside, the serious question is, are we giving you the opportunity to really find your own way? Are we telling you, for example, that there's been a statistical shift in the number of, say, Republicans and Democrats among the professoriate at Chicago? Shouldn't we be telling you those things if we want you to be free to think for yourselves? If we're trying to liberate you, that's what we're doing here at universities, respectfully learning with you, showing you our weaknesses, we should be aware, make you aware of the biases that may have led to this situation about the narrowing of diversity among the faculty. That's what worries me about it. If there's a lot of diversity among students, and then perhaps some path-dependent reasons for less diversity at the faculty level, I worry that we would do a disservice to you in terms of actually giving you the chance to genuinely search for the truth on your own.
I think that's a really interesting perspective, and I'd love to hear Professor Gross's opinion on this. Do you agree with Professor Tomasi that the issue isn't really at the undergrad level, it's more at the professorial class?
I mean, I guess it depends on you know, an issue for what outcome. You know, certainly from the standpoint of you know, campus life in the midst of a massive protest wave, the composition of the undergraduate body and its politics probably matters more than that of the professoriate in terms of what happens in the classroom and whether you know, the experiences of faculty factor in there. It's a bit of a mixed bag. You know, on surveys, students say that that when they are feel hesitant to speak in class on topics, it's usually more out of fear of what their peers will think than out of fear of what the faculty, although they also worry about what their faculty will think. So that's part of it as well. You know, I guess.
But it's more peers for sure, right?
It's more peers. I mean, but it's not faculty, I will say. Yeah. I've talked to a lot of students for a book I'm writing now. You know, really a lot say that especially those who are moderate or conservative will say that they absolutely bend what they write to get a better grade, and that's just they are upset by it, but they think it's par for the course. In terms of things that we can actually do to you know, kind of mix up the political diversity of the undergraduate body, if we were interested in doing that, you know, some of the things are sort of along the lines of what you suggested. I mean, certainly recruiting more in terms of geographic diversity could be helpful. You know, border regions, not border regions, rural, not rural. You know, giving more opportunities for veterans to you know, pursue degrees in highly selective institutions could be part of that as well. Opening up more opportunities for older students with a bit more life experience to come to these selective institutions could be that as well. It is also an interesting fact that that there's a relationship between participation in certain athletic sports and political views, and so you know, to the extent that you shut down certain forms of men's sports, for example, you reduce the political diversity of the campus, and to the extent that you grow your hockey teams and your baseball teams, you know, male hockey teams, you can increase political diversity. So you know, and there's the religious piece of that as well, right? If you have a campus that is, you know, where there's a flourishing religious life, you know, that can also attract students who are have a wider variety of political views. So you know, you can do things that might tilt the political composition of the if that was your goal a little bit, without having to directly you know, prioritize politics. You know, I would say back to the admissions piece. You know, I think that administrators and admissions officers, to the extent that they're looking for, I don't know that they're looking for political diversity per se. I think they really are looking for the people who can just actually disagree well. And whether these are effective tools for finding that or not, I don't know. But my sense is that that's a bigger priority.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, makes sense too.
Yeah, Professor Tomasi, I have another question for you. Is there a tension between prioritizing viewpoint diversity or maybe trying to hire more faculty who are conservative if your school leans more liberal or vice versa? Is there a tension between that and then institutional neutrality, which is very important at a place like the University of Chicago?
Nice.
If you come into a hiring process saying, like, I want a candidate who's going to check this box.
Killer, that's awesome. That's a great question. Yeah, there is. So it seems to me two things are true. It seems to me that the narrowing of ideological diversity or political diversity within the university on the professoriate over the past 50 years is a really significant problem. My own sense is that it's a more product of path dependency than tracking the truth, and that's a real worry to me. But just to be super clear, we don't know in advance, no one knows in advance, what the appropriate ratio of a truly free university professoriate would be regarding Republicans and Democrats. We don't know that. We don't know what the appropriate ratio of Democrats and Republicans among the undergrads would be in a free society, picking people freely with unbiased credentials. We don't know that. There's reasons why people choose to be a professor. You've written about this very well, eloquently. Oh. There's reasons why people choose to be a professor that might track their deep understandings of the world. And those deep understandings of the world also might generate different political views that they have. So it wouldn't be surprising if different sets of institutions attract people from different political ideologies, if you look at that one dimension. The important point is that, in my view, it's not political representation or proportional representation that we're after when we're after viewpoint diversity. Universities are about tracking the truth. We're about tracking knowledge. It would be disappointing if we're trying to track the truth and we have no convergence ever. We want to have different views about Hamlet, like I said, but we also want to get some consensus about whether the world's flat or round or a cube, right? So we're after those kind of truth-tracking things in the context of searching for knowledge. And to me, what that means that we're trying to create is an environment where questions are kept open in a lively way. That if there's a consensus on during a public health crisis about masks and lockdowns, fine. That's a consensus among experts. But if you can't even say Sweden, you can't even say Great Barrington Declaration, you can't even say other ways of doing it, then things are gone really, really wrong. What we see in the academy over the last 20, 30 years especially is that across a widening range of topical areas, there are views and concepts and theories which should be actively debated at universities that cannot be stated. And that's the worrying part of lack of viewpoint diversity to me.
See, I'm worried about that too, but then I want to push you on that because
Please.
You spoke earlier about sort of the limits of viewpoint diversity. Where is the limit? Should we be encouraging a 17-year-old applicant who has like an interest in fascism, for example, or a 17-year-old applicant on the other side? Like
yes. No. Yes. Sorry. Yes. No.
So should we
That
be?
didn't work very well.
No, all good. There are certain, if we can agree that the university is seeking truth, right? You can have a very diverse, set of applicants for a professorship, for example, that still might not be useful for the diversity they bring. So you wouldn't want a scientist, for example, who thought that vaccines caused autism if that's what the literature says isn't true.
That's right.
Right. So where is the limit?
Great.
How much can we accept heterodox thinking, and when do we cross that line into sort of quackery?
Yeah, that's great. So there was this question, that's again really well put. There was this question about how wide the circle of we, within which we describe ourselves as a community of imperfect learners. Does anyone get in? Does any view constantly have to be in? My own view is that we should err on the side of letting views in, but then hold them accountable. No one gets a free ride. Just because you're a Republican or whatever, you're a Trumper, whatever you might be politically, just because you have some view that's a minority view on some mainstream, I'd say a Brown, where I taught for many years, just because you have that view, that doesn't give you any free pass. On the contrary, stand and defend your position. If you want to say the moon is a cube, say it. This is a great place to say that, university. But it doesn't mean anyone's going to pay any attention to you. We have no obligation to pay attention to quacks or people who think there's cubes cruising around the Earth. But that it should be able to be stated. But I think so the parameters are set by some episteme. We're always in this epistemic, like people on a raft, building as we go. We're not building a pyramid where we know it's in, we know it's out. We're always in this process of trying to decide through contestation what's in and what's out. We may learn things about the shape of the moon that we don't know yet, because the idea of shape may change in some way. But we want universities to be the places where we err on the side of having views presented, but no one gets a free pass.
Interesting. So Alexandra, when you're counseling your students and there's sort of this amorphous window of what's acceptable and what's not, how do you help students track that in their applications? Like what's too far, what's not, what's the sweet spot for showing that you're an interesting person, you're tolerant, but like you've also got, something new to say?
I think this is where like we have to actually put and it's hard sometimes to convince students and families who are very ambitious and goal-oriented when it comes to college admissions in mind. But this is actually where we have to put some of the strategy of this behind and return to this idea that in college counseling, we're always preaching, if any of you had good college counselors, which I hope you did, of fit, where I would not counsel a student to be strategic in that. And I've had many, many students, particularly in this current climate, come to me and say, I'm worried about how my essay is going to be perceived because I'm talking about whatever it is, this aspect of my identity, my involvement in this organization, my politics, my religious belief, whatever it is, and how that's going to be perceived by this institution. And I think the answer has to be, if that institution is not interested in you because of that, that is not the institution that you should be at, right? Mm-hmm. If your involvement in that Israel advocacy group mm-hmm. is a reason why that institution denies you, mm-hmm. that is not a place that you should go, mm-hmm. right? Because that is not a place that ultimately is going to feel like a community that you want to join. Mm-hmm. Wow. And so is that scary? Is that risky? Especially if you have decided that is your first choice dream school, it is. Mm-hmm. But I would never encourage a student to shapeshift in their application because all that is going to do is land them somewhere that's going to make them extremely unhappy in the long run.
I think that brings up an interesting facet of the debate that we haven't touched on, which is students self-sorting to schools that they think their viewpoints will be accepted in. So Professor Gross, do you have any information or a viewpoint on students like picking a school based on where they think they'll fit in politically? And does that cut against the idea of sort of social engineering and making these schools viewpoint diverse for the sake of it? Mm.
So, the data I've seen suggests that politics probably is factoring more into students' college search now than was the case basically for, so far as we know, back decades and decades. It's always there around the edges, of course, but I think it's more salient now. It's not the case for everybody. A good 30% of students say that politics just does not matter at all to them, did not matter at all in their college search. And they were prioritizing things like proximity to family, cost, the quality of the education they would receive, those sorts of things. About 10% of students say that the political reputation of a school did factor into their decision, but negatively. They went despite the reputation. So something like 30% of students are taking politics pretty seriously, but they're doing that in a variety of ways, right? So one of them is geographic. So you have a lot of students now who are saying, I will not apply to a school in the South because I'm worried about reproductive rights there. Or students are saying, I will not apply to a school in the North because I'm worried about the lack of my ability to carry a gun in a certain place. So you're seeing a lot of geographic sorting. Now, some of that is, most students have always gone to school where in states where they grow up. It's, I think 80% of students go to school in state. But that's significant. And then there's some who are really interested in political fit. They really want to be in a place where people think roughly like they do, and there's lots of those students. There's a small group of students who want to be in a place where people don't think like they do, or where they feel like they'll at least be safe to think something that's a little bit heterodox. So it's certainly part of the search process now. It's hard to play itself out because the process is so competitive. You can't always choose your school. You might go where you have to get in, but it's certainly part of the landscape now. And schools are doubling down on it in terms of the recruitment process, right? Schools like Vanderbilt, Chicago are really playing up the free speech piece. Right. That's what they're going to do. That's where you want to go. If you have slightly non-progressive views, maybe that's where you're going to be safe to express yourself. So it's also factoring into basically the college advertising process.
That's fascinating. Professor Tomasi, could you also respond to that? I'm curious to hear your view.
Remind me how you put the question. Was it about self-sorting?
Self-sorting. Mm-hmm. And if people are prone to self-sorting, like, should there be a sort of normative social engineering to get them to go to a school that they wouldn't ordinarily have gone to? Is that interfering with sort of their own free will?
Oh, man. I don't know. I mean, I was such a bad student that I was in and out of, as an undergrad, I was in and out of 4 different places. And every place where I went, people self-sorted, and they were really different, like from each of the places I was involved. But I'm not sure how that's relevant. Well, so are you asking, is there self-sorting?
No, not asking is there self-sorting, but just given that self-sorting happens,
Yeah.
like at this large scale,
Yeah.
is there even any point in trying to make a specific institution ideologically diverse if the student could just go to a place where they find sort of community, and then there is ideological diversity at the national level, but like at a local level, maybe there doesn't have to be.
I got you. So systemically,
Yeah.
you know, one of the really striking things about the American educational system is the fact of the diversity of the types of institutions. So in the late 1800s, I think it was like around 1880, there were 4 universities in England, and that was quite enough, thank you. At that time, there were 44 universities and colleges in Ohio alone. And there was nothing, at the time people would say, there's nothing more American than starting a college or a university. And we have this incredible pluralism of university types in the US. It's now difficult to start colleges, as some conservatives are finding out, trying to start their own conservative colleges. But for a long time in America, there was this, especially after the Civil War, an efflorescence of university building, college building, all kinds of idiosyncratic kooks building colleges because of their idea of what a good worker would be, or an idea of what a different kind of religious, all kinds of views on that issue. So that's part of the system that we're in. We're in a system that's enormously diverse, with lots of opportunities for people to find the right place for them. I'm just so struck by what you said about people finding their own way, and I would add a word to what you said, which is something like the word integrity. That thing that we described statistically, I'm aware also that at Brown, you know, many of my students I talked to, seniors especially, would describe to me how many times they had lied about what they believed politically because they're afraid of their TA or their professor's view. And that was like a shocking thing. Like a seminar I taught in my last semester at Brown with 20 students in it, more than half the class described literally not telling the truth, things they believed, like actually writing down things they didn't believe because they were afraid about a grade. So that question about integrity or authenticity, which arises later on in life, many times in our lives, many times in your lives, that question will arise and you'll be tested. It's arising at this incredibly high stakes public moment where, you know, which is torturous for people because they're all being watched and ranked for the first time in their lives. They're being ripped out of the womb, and now they're like, who are you? How are you going to be sorted compared to your colleagues? So no wonder the tension to give up, to not be authentic is so great. But I was just really struck by the way you put that, and I think that's deeply right, that following a path is truer than faking a path.
Yeah.
I would just also add something interesting I'm seeing. I think there used to be more pre the current administration. I think there, with my students at least, there was a little bit of a feeling that like a separation between the college or university and the state, which I think, Professor Christie, you're speaking to a little bit, because oftentimes colleges and universities are these little worlds into themselves, right? That can mirror their location very much, but can also look radically different politically and demographically than wherever they're situated. I'm starting to see, because of just kind of the climate right now, families really kind of differentiating between public and private institutions geographically. Like if we look at what's happening at like University of Virginia, for example, as like a prime example, and really being much more aware of, if I'm considering a public institution especially, I need to be taking into account the politics of the state that I'm considering that in, just kind of like understanding how state legislation could impact, right, my education. And I wasn't having those conversations with families or being asked questions like I am in the same way 2 years ago.
Certainly, and that very helpfully moves us into the last topic before we hit the Q&A. So Professor Gross, the Trump administration demanded in 2025 that Harvard commission an outside party to audit community members for viewpoint diversity. So this has become an incredibly divisive political issue, especially at the federal level. What does that mean for the future of this concept? Has it become too political to be like a useful thing anymore, or where do you see this going?
So when I mentioned earlier that there was a shift, an inflection point in the college admissions process after the Palestine protests and encampments of 23-24, there was a build there not just to prioritize something like greater political tolerance among undergraduates, but there was also a sense among the faculty that at many top institutions that the politics of the faculty had gone too far, that they thought that there was somehow a connection between the politics of the faculty and the prevalence of protests that people felt had veered into anti-Semitism in many cases. And so there was a push on the part of at least some faculty to increase the political diversity of the faculty. Ironically, that has now largely stalled because of the efforts of the Trump administration. So, as soon as the Trump administration kind of came after the university kind of closed ranks.
So the action had the opposite effect.
Exactly. So, I think that, if the goal really was to try to shift things around politically, I think that had the opposite effect of what it was intended to have. I think there are efforts underway, both at the federal level and at state levels, to find alternate paths to increase the political diversity of the faculty. So you're seeing a growth of these of civic centers at the state level, funded by state institutions, but also with significant funding from the NEH, for instance, as of late. So those are efforts to sort of sidestep that, provide an alternative way to increase the number of faculty positions that might be available to people, to faculty with more conservative views. So those efforts are underway. I think that it's a mess. As you might imagine, there's very minimal support among faculty for anything like this right now. And I don't know that will change anytime soon, but it's a little hard to say, right? I mean, faculty might, in some cases, prefer that there were more political diversity among the faculty, but the faculty are now very protective of the idea that they should be the ones to make the determination as to who to hire, and that the criteria should be intellectual, not political. And so even if they might want more conservatives around, I think very few faculty are willing to say, we want to hire on the grounds of conservatism. Sure. We want to hire on the grounds of scientific merit.
Thank you. Final word to you, Professor Tomasi. The political climate around this is very charged. How do you see that working? Do you agree with Professor Gross that the Trump administration's actions have sort of stunted these efforts at ideological diversity?
Yeah, my life got really difficult last January.
Yeah.
And it's been steadily difficult.
Since the Trump administration.
Yeah. But let me just say a word about the broader issue, which this is very much connected to. There's a question at the center of this: who owns the university? Whose is it? And one answer is something like, the government owns it. The government's elected in a democracy. They get to say what the university is like. That's an answer that the Trump administration in many ways is pushing. It's a populist view of that democratic interpretation of the government owning the institution. A rival view, which was lively at Chicago and other places when they were founded, was that the trustees who gave the money for the place, they own the university. There's a big kerfuffle about it at Stanford a long time ago, around the time Chicago was founded, because Jane Stanford, who gave the money for the flipping place, didn't like a professor for a bunch of reasons and wanted that professor fired. And it raised the question: who owns the university? Is it the wealthy donor who gave the money? That's also not the right answer. The right answer is closer to what you were saying a moment ago. The university is something like a public trust for the pursuit of knowledge. So who owns the university? The knowledge seekers, the one who cares about knowledge. And there's this beautiful essay, AAUP 1914, where they talk about this case, not about the Trump case, but about the Stanford case. And they talk about why universities have to be given to, authority has to be given to professors and administrators as a public trust. But they also add this warning, and I'll end with this. They say that universities need to be given this special autonomy within a free and democratic society where the experts get to use their expertise to decide who's in and who's out, students and professors alike, precisely because the truth-seeking purpose is so important. But if they fail to discharge these responsibilities, if we professors as a class fail to keep viewpoint diversity alive, to create a conditions in which you guys can think for yourselves, to discharge that obligation to society of treating all political views equally and seriously, if we fail at that, inadvertently or on purpose, then someone else will step in and do the job for us. That is the government. And that's what we're seeing in a lot of ways. So there's a deep question about who owns the university, what it should be like. One answer that I like, that I think we all like, is that the university should be owned and corrected by professors. Those of us who live here and love the place should love it enough to try to make it better before outsiders come in who don't love it or know it nearly as well as we do.
Thank you, Professor Tomasi. And with that, I'd like to open it up for Q&A in the crowd.
Thank you for coming to this panel. My name is Marty. I'm a fourth year in the college studying human rights. My question is for the panel generally, not for any specific person. But speaking as someone who is from this community, I grew up on the south side of Chicago in Englewood, just not too far away. And as a current UChicago student, how should a university admissions counselor grapple with the reality that quote unquote viewpoint diversity is shaped by the lived experience of an individual and their exposure to different social issues, such that when demographic diversity or other sort of means of identifying someone's kind of identity or whatever, like race, class, etc., is limited, viewpoint diversity is also constrained, particularly in a post-affirmative action kind of era. So, yeah.
It's an excellent question and a very complicated one. And I'm gonna quickly correct one thing you said, which anytime a student or anyone I'm engaging with uses post-affirmative action, I always like to correct it and say we are in a post-race-based affirmative action. We are not in a post-affirmative action era. Affirmative action is alive and well. Legacy is affirmative action. Residency for in-state tuition purposes is affirmative action. Considering a student's gender is affirmative action, considering what a student's going to study, socioeconomic stat, like there is affirmative action. I would very much make the argument that this push for viewpoint diversity, I do believe, this is not the official views of the Latin School of Chicago, these are the official views of Alexandra Fields. I do believe that this push for viewpoint diversity is affirmative action for largely white men. I do believe that. Just by virtue of if we were to put in a room of people together and say who would benefit from this in an admissions committee, that is who it would be. That's whose identity is being affirmed in this. So I just have to name that. I think that the answer, right, the only way that like this can actually work in an admissions process and admissions offices that are doing good work, and I think the University of Chicago is doing good work, I will say, is it has to be and. Like, yes, consider viewpoint diversity and. Like, absolutely, having more conservative students on campus, if your campus is skewing very strongly liberal, that would make it a better campus. And so would being a more racially diverse campus. And so would be having more socioeconomically diverse students on campus. And so would be having more students from rural areas. Like, it has to be all of those things. The issue is that the Supreme Court, like, it has become illegal and it has become increasingly more difficult to consider race. And universities are under threat, right, if they do in any explicit way. Now, the ruling is very unclear, and they can kind of consider it as lived experience, but kind of not. And if you've read that thing, I mean, it is like...
It's very confusing.
It's crazy. It's crazy. But I think it's all about like what are we considering, what are we not considering? And what have we decided is allowed to be considered and what isn't? What can we value and what can't we value? And I think that will tell you a lot about what a country prioritizes, what an institution prioritizes.
Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you. My name's Austin. I'm a first-year graduate student in the BSD. And my question
in the
is
what?
in the biological science division.
Oh, cool.
It's been mentioned at several points that the following two things are true. The first is that a vastly disproportionate number of people in positions of power in the American professional class attend a small number of elite institutions. The second is that more than 95% of undergraduates in this country do not attend those elite institutions, and a larger still number of young people never go to college at all. So with that in mind, how much does the political landscape of our colleges actually matter? If we're trying to rebalance the undergrad composition of UChicago or Yale or Harvard, is that a conversation about what we want out of our undergraduate institutions and our institutions of higher learning, or is that really the latest front in the culture war and part of a broader conversation about our political culture?
I think that's a great question. Professor Gross, do you want to take it first?
Sure. You know, if you talk to people in the Trump administration, they will say that they are certainly concerned with elite institutions, but part of what they are interested in, they will say, is shifting the focus away from exactly the kinds of institutions that you're talking about, right? They would, I think, rather that more money, more grant dollars, more students go to, the University of Oklahoma than get funneled to Yale or the University of Chicago. So I think they're interested in some kind of a shift, away from those institutions as well. That would be their preference, as well as a preference that somewhat fewer students go to college. So I think you're right. It is the case, though, that on the one hand, there are lots of students who go to public universities, and there is a lot of effort underway in places like Florida and North Carolina to work on this intellectual diversity, viewpoint diversity question. And so you're seeing efforts in those states to develop alternative accreditation systems that would prioritize viewpoint diversity as a condition of accreditation at those schools. So at schools that are not necessarily selective, that's a real issue. And at the same time, it's also the case that these very selective institutions do funnel students into very powerful positions in our society. And so, you could argue that to the extent that there is insufficient viewpoint diversity, political diversity, whatever term you want to use, that potentially could have an impact on the way that that levers get pulled later on. So I think your point is smart and well taken, but I think that at least folks on the right who are pushing for more political diversity would say it's not just a cultural war point. Now, it may be just a cultural war point, but I think they would argue that it's more than that.
I think that's a fascinating answer, and Professor Tomasi, I'd love to bring you in here because the Trump administration, while they might say in one sentence, yes, we care very much about the trade schools and these state universities, in the next breath, they'll focus all of their attention on Harvard University. Right? So there is a fixation on these elite institutions.
Yeah.
So I guess what are the stakes of this problem?
Yeah, you've probably seen that Steve Pinker op-ed about Harvard derangement syndrome.
Certainly.
That was pretty cool. I'll add one thing that we haven't said that it's not going to be directly on this, but it might be helpful to it perhaps. So just one thing I think it's important to know about, we think about the eliteness and the small numbers of people involved in these kind of conversations. It's really important, I think, just to recognize or remember that historically, it was those elite East Coast schools who were the slowest to diversify, who were the slowest to be inclusive, who are the slowest to really try to think about reaching out to expand the range of people admitted so they can become more truly truth-seeking universities. The final Ivy League university only began graduating women in 1987. I know this seems like ancient history to you. I graduated from college in 1987, and my daughter says to me, 1987, like some others. I know, but it's not that. This is like yesterday, people. This is the Ivy League, right? That's the last Ivy League school to actually start graduating women. People of color had to go to Oberlin for like about 60 years because the universities on the East Coast would rarely take a person who was black. So there's just something interesting, strange, interesting ironies here about how Western schools, for a variety of reasons, Michigan was fantastic with women way earlier. A lot of Western schools were much more progressive in their admissions policies. than were the elite ones. And now the ire of the Trump administration is sort of like, it's almost like for their sins, the Ivy League schools have like gone the other direction. They're like, overcompensating in some bizarre way. And the Trump administration sort of, I mean, for the Trump, I'll just say briefly that my own view is that it's a classic populist playbook. And if you're playing a populist playbook, of course you want Harvard. There was an essay written out by this guy, Max Eden, I think it was in November, shortly before the election, about what Trump should do. And he said Trump should begin by taking a prize scalp. He should destroy Columbia. One of Trump's first moves was to go after Columbia and take a prize scalp. But he realized along the way, you know what? Harvard's a much better scalp. I'll take that one instead. He hasn't got it. And it'll be a great tragedy for our American system of education if he gets it or gets Chicago or anywhere else. But that's what he's after.
Thank you.
Hello. Hi, my name is Elijah. I'm a fourth year in the college. I have a question in response to Professor Tomasi's comment to Elsa in regard to do we want to have more quacks coming to universities?
Yeah.
I think one of the conversations we said earlier is the goal to make professorships later on to be more diverse, and that starts off with having a diverse student body. But I think it's also true to say the Democratic and Republican Party has shifted a lot in recent years towards a different form of truth value. And the same professors who may have been conservative 5-10 years ago in a professorship now are a lot different in the demographics coming to university today. So how do we weigh a large amount of new wave of conservatism going to this viewpoint diversity aspect? We're seeing a lot of those trends going towards men, as the mission officers saying, are the ones who are valuing and going to be an asset towards this viewpoint emissions. Do we allow that to attack the academic rigor of our institutions and be part of that discourse just because it's a different viewpoint? Right. Or should we be removing it altogether? Because I do think there's some value that sometimes having information that is not credible is not conducive to an environment of learning, and that should be recognized.
Nice.
It's a great question.
Oh my God, that's so good.
Professor Tomasi, do you want to start with that?
Oh yeah, thank you.
You seemed enthusiastic.
That's just such an awesome question. And I won't surprise you, it probably won't surprise you what I'm going to say, but I'm just going to do it anyway. Universities are about searching for knowledge. And if there are parties or groups who don't take seriously imperatives that come with that, like make your case with evidence, stand and deliver, and take the questions that come your way, and let us decide how convinced we are about you. If you don't take evidence seriously, then you've got no serious place in this domain. Now, is it true that one party is not taking evidence seriously and the other one is? I've got some worries, people. I know it's kind of a comfortable view in certain circles that I travel in a lot. I know a lot of people on the far left, my friends and dear colleagues at Brown and other places where I've been a professor, who, believe me, are really hard to move with evidence because they've got this little bubble around them too. But so there's a lot of that. There's enough of that to go around the human species wherever we might be. So I'm not going to lay it on one political party. But insofar as a political party or people adherents to a party do reject evidence giving, do reject truth seeking, do reject the possibility of expertise, they don't have any special place here. I doubt they belong here at all. Welcome, let them in, but make them stand up, let's talk to them. Or if it's really boring, because it's so wacky, we'll ignore it. So that's what I would say about that.
I guess the question that I would pose, or the concern that I'm kind of thinking of as we talk about this is as you two would know far better than me, I only know it from watching some friends go through it. The searching for a professorship, that process is vicious. I mean, those positions are so competitive.
Really?
And the number of positions that are available and the competition for those is just insane. So it is actually a zero-sum game, right? There are a limited number of opportunities that are available. And a couple of years ago, what we were talking about largely when we were talking about interest in hiring on so many college campuses was diversifying our faculty to include more underrepresented people of color. Right. We didn't solve that problem. It's not check, right, at all. And now that's out of style, and we've moved on, I guess, as a nation. And so now we've decided this is the issue. And DEI has been made a bad word, and we're not calling this DEI, we're calling it something else, but though this is at the cost of something else, right? Like prioritizing this is unfortunate. I wish we could prioritize everything, but it is, when there's one position open, what's going to be prioritized? And so I guess I'm wondering, like, who makes those decisions, and how have we decided that this is the thing that should be most prioritized, is most important for the function of the ideal university?
Yeah, I think you make a compelling case that it's certainly zero sum, and like even if it's not the biggest factor, it's a factor, and it's going to be a game changer. Yeah.
If I was just going to add to your point about what is the appropriate limit for who we should get to include, I've made this point on numerous occasions, and it rarely gets traction, but I'll try it once more. If you wanted to do one thing to significantly increase the share of professors who held conservative beliefs, it would be get better conservatism.
Oh, say more, please.
I think that part of what we're seeing, there's lots of reasons that the professoriate has become more left-leaning, some of which I've written about, but part of it is that this is also a period in which the form of conservatism that has kind of taken hold, that is the kind of a populist nationalist conservatism, is something that a lot of faculty are kind of naturally allergic to. If there were a reinvention of the conservative movement that was more kind of intellectual, more democratic, kind of more small L liberal, I think there would probably be a likelihood of greater interest in that on the part of the faculty. And I think when it's not surprising that many of the conservative faculty that I know are very much opposed to the Trump administration, partly on those grounds. Rebuild the conservative movement, and you might get some more diversity.
Yeah, easy to do.
Can I say something about that? So can I agree with part of that, but I just want to point out the other side of it, because there's been a large shift in the Democratic Party too in recent years. We're a long way away from Hillary Clinton being a lefty. And there are views held by people in the mainstream now left wing and center left wing of the Democratic Party, which are anti-scientific to a shocking degree. Economic views, defending exploded economic theories, views about sexuality and whether sex is binary or not as a biological matter, like wacky views that are very anti-evidence based. So there's plenty of that to go around. I think there may be some special way it's been served up on the right. It doesn't have the accent of a PBS who kind of puts this stuff in a certain kind of spin that makes you like a snake charmer if you've grown up that way. But the drive on each extreme side towards anti-evidence-based ways of holding their views and painting the other as being unworthy of conversation is left and right, in my opinion. I think it's partly why our society is so polarized.
Just going to add one point to that, though, which is that the modal professor in the U.S., the political ideology falls somewhere between that of Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. So let's not.
But as you know, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yes, but let's not exaggerate the extent of that.
But if we break,
commitment.
But as you and I know well, if you break that stat down in terms of cohort age, it starts to change a lot. There's a lot of old people who are professors. Well, you can get some sort of modal thing there. But if you do like assistant professors, for example, it's a much greater skew. I'm not saying they're anti-scientific, but there's a rise of anti-scientism within the university, which is a real phenomenon. There's a rise of a certain way of being at the university where you're not putting the questions first, you're putting the conclusions first. And that's a fundamentally anti-scientific and I think anti-truth-seeking ideology. It's alive and growing in many campuses.
And you're saying
from the left.
From the left, okay.
From the left, yeah.
I was just curious when that study was done. That looked at professors' ideology.
I did it last week. So.
Fascinating. That's so interesting.
You came prepared. Okay, next question.
That's so interesting.
Hi, I'm Felix. I'm a fourth-year undergraduate student. Question I had was that I think in this support of viewpoint diversity in the academy, I see sort of two big implicit underpinning assumptions, or maybe ideals, one might call them. And one is that scientific progress happens in large part through in orthodoxy challenging and therefore heterodoxy challenging and therefore improving in orthodoxy, and two, that this heterodoxy in the academy has not, across fields, hasn't been given a chance, and if it was given a chance, sort of the bad ideas would be struck down and the good ideas would float to the top. And I think the thing I would challenge and maybe ask for a response on is, like if you look in fields, say like physics and economics, you have an orthodox or a heterodoxy, which is also has been scientifically unsuccessful or marginal in its scientific contributions. And further than that, while they've been unsuccessful, they remain, I would say, in some ways corrosive because they are so convincing. For instance, it's much easier to say the standard model of physics is flawed without proposing an alternative than it is to defend that standard model.
Nice.
So how do you therefore say, oh, those bad ideas will sink and that won't be an obstruction to future science
It's great.
learning?
Do you want
Professor Tomasi, you want to start with that?
I'd rather someone else did.
Okay.
Do you want to say something about that?
What were you looking at?
No, I mean, it's a fascinating question of,
Oh, so I'll do it. So I love it, right? It goes to some really interesting debates, critiques of John Stuart Mill from sort of crit theory perspectives. I mean, Mill sort of says, we'll have a bunch of free exchange of ideas, and we'll have a marketplace, and the best idea will win. That's great. But a string of thinkers, starting in the late 60s, but since then too, have been saying, well, it depends. That's true, John Stuart Mill. That's right. If you have a free exchange of ideas, blah, blah, blah. But if there's background structures of power which are really unequal, that might affect the way what comes out. It's a perilous critique. If you think about the marketplace's idea, do the same critique through economics, where you have a free market, but you have very grossly unequal shares of wealth to go into the market. The outcomes of inequality of power going into the market will probably be reflected and magnified, perhaps, by that market. So similarly, too, perhaps with the intellectual sphere. So that's kind of a classic problem in Millian analysis of the critiques. But I would just say that it's weird to realize how fragile this whole endeavor of a social system actually is. Our tethering ourselves to reality, our ability to know when a system is actually going to be work in this world or actually just miss the way this world actually is, or miss the way human beings actually are, is extremely fragile. And the Western liberal consensus, that kind of a set of liberal democratic institutions, is a certain way of answering the question, how should people live together in this world? That's tethered to reality in such ways that it seems to have some evidence that it's working, with all kinds of gross mistakes and errors along the way. But universities are about that tethering, that thin tethering to reality. It can go wrong in all kinds of ways. I think it's really important to recognize that. I mean, I loved your point. I think it really just shows that you think the free exchange of ideas is going to get you truth like this. It's just not true. We're still going to be human, all too human, all the way through. So that's not a full answer to what you said, but what you said really resonates with me.
so it sounds like the upshot of your point is that this sort of free exchange of ideas, marketplace of ideas, is the best way that we have to find the good ideas and have them float to the top.
I think it is.
Okay.
I think it is. And we have to constantly be thinking, how are our biases affecting the way we're actually practicing those norms? Mm-hmm. To what degree are we really doing a free exchange of ideas? Because most professors, most people think they're free thinking. Most of us think we want to be free thinking. But the reality is it's an unnatural practice. Open-mindedness is a deeply unnatural practice for a human being. We are much more tribal for all kinds of evolutionary and different kinds of sets of reasons than we are open-minded and scholarly. Mm. Scholarship is a deeply unnatural practice. What you're doing here as undergrads, what you claim you're doing here as undergrads, thinking for yourselves, what I claim it is we're here to provide to you, that you get a chance to think for yourselves. It's a deeply unnatural practice. Good luck if you can do it. But if you don't do it, imagine.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Hello, I'm Lucas. I'm a fourth year studying econ and computer science. And one of the things two things struck me in this conversation. The first is the question of like, who owns the university? And like, if the university's purpose is to seek truth, like, what does that mean exactly? Like, is truth like manifested in like better products or better understandings of the world or better policies? Who is using those truths? And then the other thing that struck me was the idea that like, if you want conservatism to like be more appealing to colleges, you need to get better conservatism. And I would argue that that may flow the other direction too. Like, if you want better, like if you want conservatives to believe the academy more, you may need to get better science as well.
Nice.
Because one of the concerns, I think, from the conservative side has been that like sometimes professors may like lean on p-hacking to like get their paper published in a publication that very explicitly endorses Joe Biden. And so like, how seriously do we really have to take this publication? And like, if they're expressing concerns about climate change in the same publication, like how compromised is that concern? And kind of given that all of these outputs, this truth, does have to be used by the government, and the government also comes back around and funds those institutions, it seems to me as though like there may need to be some kind of stake outside of the university that owns it, if it is to be taken seriously by people outside of the university and like to kind of make good use of that truth. And I think a lot of what we're seeing is like the people who are now not really enamored by how useful this truth is are winding back their funding commitments and visa commitments and so on that kind of make all these places possible. So like, what do you make about the idea that forces outside of the university get to determine what is true and what is kosher for professors to say?
What's kosher?
Well, okay, like what is okay for professors to be kind of chasing as avenues of truth in terms of like which way they choose to go with what is true?
Yeah, that's great.
I guess Professor Gross, yeah.
Sure. Well, just in terms of the science ecosystem, I think it's notable that, and I think speaks to your point, historically it's been the case that industry does the lion's share of applied research, and universities do the lion's share of the basic research. That's shifting. I believe now industry has now surpassed universities in the share of basic research that they do, even though it's a little bit different. And part of that might have to do with this question of how can we guarantee the usefulness of different kinds of truths, and what are we willing to fund? I think that part of the challenge for universities may be less that the model of truth-seeking we've been using is flawed, and more that our ways of showing people that what we're doing is not flawed, is flawed. And I'm thinking of writing a piece by Sheila Jasanoff, who's a science and technology scholar, who notes that every society has its way of establishing what people think of will count as truth, and that part of the problem that American science has had, and social science in particular, is that we've done a not as great job as we could do of displaying very publicly and very transparently exactly what it is we're doing in ways that can produce the kind of confidence and reassurance that the science should have. So I think part of the answer to how do you show that is not to say that we need to be pursuing truth differently. But part of it might be we need to do a much better job of showing people exactly how we're pursuing truth, and let the chips fall where they may when that process becomes much more transparent. Because I think people are demanding that transparency in all aspects of institutional life now. Right? There's a lot of skepticism about higher education. There's a lot of skepticism about every kind of institution at the moment. And I think rebuilding trust through transparency is part of the answer for science.
And then, John, I want to give the last word to you, just as we're running out of time here. Could you answer that other part of Lucas's question? Do we need a better conservatism for truth-seeking? Like, is the current brand of right-wing populism, is that serving truth-seeking at the university level? Would you agree with Professor Gross?
So I mentioned before that AUP article where they say the university owns the knowledge seekers, but it has to. There's a constraint on that. I think that it has to play a certain kind of role of tethering us to reality. I just want to make one last point, if I may, and I've used this term, we've all used the term, the truth-seeking role at the university. And I usually don't do that. I think it's actually a fundamental mistake. I don't think truth is anything of particular interest to us. I think what we really care about is knowledge-seeking. Truth, you can have a truth, something that actually corresponds with the way you can have a belief that corresponds with the way the world is for some wacky reason. You might think something about the world, and you think it because you saw some Britney Spears TikTok video where she said it when you were 9 and you still believe it, and you go through this college and you still believe that thing. But if you have the belief that's true because you have reasons for it, that's what we care about. Knowledge is a more epistemically complex and compound concept than truth. Knowledge means something like having an idea, a belief that may have some corresponds to the way the world is, but crucially, you actively have reasons or justifications for that. I think what we're fundamentally doing at the university is working on our ability, our muscles for knowledge. And what we're doing with each of you is not trying to tether you to the reality in a particular way, but we're trying to develop your ability to give and understand reasons, to evaluate reasons for yourselves. That's what we're really trying to do well. I'm more skeptical than some of my fellow panelists about if the society know more fully what we're doing within universities and what goes on within universities, that they would have greater trust for us. There are some things, some trends in current universities like citation justice, which is one of the fundamental eroders of the knowledge-seeking role of the university that are big time and not well known yet. But there's, if the truth were known more fully, I'm not sure that it would be, we'd get a lot more applause than we're currently getting, and we're not getting much right now.
I think that leaves us a lot to grapple with. Thank you all so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.